For years, Lifeson said it plainly, over and over, to anyone who asked, "There's no way Rush will ever exist again. Not maybe someday, not never say never." A flat, repeated no. And honestly, it made sense. His bandmate, his brother in music for over 4 decades, was gone. Peart had died, and Lifeson had lost more than a drummer. He'd lost the reason the whole thing worked. Then, in October 2025, he and Geddy Lee shocked the entire music world by announcing a full-scale North American tour for 2026. So what actually changed? How does someone go from saying, "There's no way this ever happens again," to standing on a stage playing Rush's music in front of thousands of people? Today I'm walking through the real story, the grief that shut Lifeson down completely, the years he spent firmly closing that door, and the quiet, unplanned moment that slowly cracked it back open. Stay till the end because the way this actually happened is a lot more human than a typical band reunion story. To understand how significant this reunion really is, you have to go back to January 2020, when Peart passed away from brain cancer, and look at what that loss actually did to Lifeson personally. Lifeson has been remarkably honest about this. In the aftermath, he lost all motivation to play guitar, not played less often, lost it entirely. He's described how music simply felt empty to him during that period, to the point where he couldn't even play for more than 10 minutes at a time before he'd have to put the instrument down. Think about what that actually means for someone who had spent essentially his entire adult life as a guitarist in one of the most technically respected bands in rock history. The instrument that had defined his identity for decades suddenly felt hollow in his hands. That's not writer's block, that's not creative fatigue, that's grief so heavy it disconnected him from the thing he'd built his whole life around. And that disconnection didn't last a few weeks or a few months. It shaped years of his life. By 2021, Lifeson wasn't just privately grieving, he was publicly, repeatedly closing the door on any future for Rush. He told media outlets directly that Rush had effectively ended at their final live show in Los Angeles back in 2015, meaning, in his mind, the band's story was already finished before Peart even died. He maintained, firmly and consistently, that a core part of the band's magic was gone, and that it simply could not be replicated without Peart behind the kit. This wasn't a passing comment made once in a single interview. This was Lifeson's consistent public position for years. If you'd asked him directly during that stretch whether Rush would ever tour or perform again, the answer would have been an unambiguous no, delivered with the kind of certainty that comes from someone who has actually thought it through, not someone just deflecting a question they haven't fully processed. That's important context for understanding just how surprising this 2026 tour announcement actually is. This isn't a band that left the door slightly open and eventually walked back through it. This is a band whose surviving members spent years actively insisting that door was permanently shut. So what actually changed? Based on what Lifeson and Lee have described, it wasn't a business decision, and it wasn't some grand plan to honor Peart through a big anniversary tour. It started much smaller than that. After roughly a decade away from any kind of rigorous touring, Lifeson and Geddy Lee began casually jamming together again, not with any real plan behind it, just picking up their instruments and playing, largely as a way to process their grief and simply see how it actually felt to make music together again. That distinction matters a lot. This wasn't two musicians strategizing a comeback. This was two old friends decades into a relationship that started long before Rush ever became Rush, quietly finding their way back to something that used to define them purely because they wanted to, with no external pressure attached. And what they found, according to both of them, was that they missed it. Not just the music in some abstract nostalgic sense, but specifically the intense challenge of playing Rush's genuinely complex catalog. Rush's material has never been simple. It's built on odd time signatures, intricate arrangements, and technical demands that most rock bands never attempt. Rediscovering how satisfying it was to actually wrestle with that complexity again seems to have been a real part of what pulled them back in. That's the part of this story that stands out the most to me. The reunion wasn't born from a marketing meeting or an anniversary date on a calendar. It was born from two grieving friends jamming together with no agenda and slowly realizing they still had something left to give. In October 2025, Geddy Lee and Lifeson made it official, announcing a full-scale North American headline tour for 2026, built around celebrating over 50 years of Rush's history. Given everything Lifeson had said publicly for years leading up to that point, the announcement genuinely shocked the music community. This wasn't a quiet, low-key club tour either. This was a full-scale headline run, explicitly framed around Rush's extensive history, meaning the shows would need to actually deliver on the weight of that catalog, not just offer a scaled-down, greatest hits version of what Rush used to be. To pull that off, they needed to solve the obvious, enormous problem sitting at the center of the entire reunion: who plays Neil Peart's parts. The solution came in the form of German drumming prodigy Annika Nilles, who was brought in specifically to handle Peart's legendary, technically demanding percussion parts. If you've followed her work on this tour already, you know she's built her own reputation on exactly the kind of complex, fusion-influenced drumming background that made her uniquely suited to take on material this difficult, and she's since won over a genuinely skeptical fanbase in the process. Alongside her, keyboardist Lauren Gold joined the lineup as well. Known for his touring work with The Who, brought in to help fill out the band's full live sound for a catalog that, especially in its later years, leaned heavily on keyboards alongside guitar, bass, and drums. Bringing in outside musicians to fill Peart's role could easily have felt like a betrayal to longtime fans, especially given how firmly Lifeson himself had insisted for years that this exact scenario could never work. But there's a crucial detail that changed the entire framing of this decision. The tour moved forward with the full support and blessing of Neil Peart's own family. That detail alone reshapes how this reunion should be understood. This isn't Lee and Lifeson deciding on their own to move on from Peart's memory and quietly replace him. This is a decision made with the direct involvement and approval of the people closest to him, the people with the most legitimate claim to protecting his legacy. Both Lee and Lifeson have been explicit and consistent about one thing throughout this entire process. This is not an attempt to replace or erase Neil Peart. That distinction has clearly been important to them, and they've made a point of saying it directly, repeatedly, rather than letting fans assume anything different. Instead, the tour, which includes full performances of iconic Rush albums like Moving Pictures, 19, is being framed as an ongoing celebration of Peart's extraordinary life, his lyrics, and his musical legacy. The music continues, in other words, specifically as a way of keeping his contribution alive and in front of audiences, not as a way of moving past him. That framing matters practically as much as it matters emotionally. Rush's catalog, especially an album like Moving Pictures, is inseparable from Peart's drumming and lyric writing. Performing that material in full isn't a neutral business decision, it's an active choice to keep putting his creative work in front of people, night after night, on a massive stage, rather than letting it exist only on old recordings. Alex Lifeson spent years telling anyone who'd listen that Rush was over, permanently, completely, with no ambiguity. And he meant it. That wasn't a bluff or a negotiating position. It came from real, genuine grief that had disconnected him from the instrument that defined his entire adult life. What eventually brought him back wasn't a business opportunity or outside pressure. It was two old friends quietly jamming together, rediscovering how much they missed both the music and each other, and eventually deciding, with Neil Peart's own family standing behind them, that the right way to honor him wasn't silence. It was keeping his music and his legacy alive on stage. If you want to go deeper into this story, let me know in the comments. From the 2000 serves, I can pull up the current 2026 tour dates and cities, break down the set list from recent shows, or dig further into Annika Nilles' background and how she prepared to take on Peart's parts. Hit subscribe for more deep dives into the real stories behind rock's biggest bands. See you in the next one.